Hello, and welcome to this episode of Peace in the Time of a Pandemic, a summer video short series from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, part of the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. I'm Ruthann Johansen, Professor Emerita in the Program of Liberal Studies and Kroc Institute Faculty Fellow, and I'm joined today by E. Jane Doering, Director Emerita of the Teachers as Scholars program at Notre Dame. Today we present A Summer Solstice Fire in Pandemic Time, the prophetic imaginations of Flannery O'Connor and Simone Weil. A version of this conversation was given for the Lewis Library in Lewis, Delaware.
This summer solstice, we recognize and celebrate the prophetic light Flannery O'Connor and Simone Weil, as creative artists, brought to us. From time immemorial, human beings have grown uneasy at the solstice, when the walls separating the material and spiritual worlds seem tissue paper thin. Anxious pagan peoples worried whether the diminishing light would return after the coming long and dark winter. So they built huge sacred fires to celebrate and placate the sun, that its nourishing light might always restore humankind. This midsummer, the world struggles with a lethal coronavirus that reveals long-standing insidious social injustices, stemming from a psychological mindset that hinders the creation of a loving community. These two intellectually gifted women offer prescient guidance as to how to renew the light that radiates from the world's order and from true love of neighbor.
Both the French philosopher Simone Weil and US fiction writer Flannery O'Connor perceived and were committed to the unity of the material and spiritual worlds. Both used their creative imaginations to bear prophetic witness to the reality of the presence of the divine in the everyday matter and manners of the temporal physical world, which both believed had lost a sense of the sacred. Whereas Weil expressed philosophical concepts derived from her experiences and observations, O'Connor depicted in concrete human interactions familiar in her region and country to point toward mystery and supernatural reality.
Simone Weil's contemporary, Albert Camus, describes in his Nobel Prize-winning novel, The Plague, a metaphorical pandemic that releases the seeds of destruction inherent within us all. The French existentialist later published posthumously 11 volumes of Weil's writings, calling her the only great spirit of our times. Weil's idea that we all harbor the potential to unleash a pandemic that could eventually destroy us and our culture resonated with Camus' existentialist philosophy of the absurd. He agreed with human complicity in the plague's harsh effects, unless one remains mindful that the laws of the cosmos operate with harsh necessity, that the plight of the suffering demands attention, that our own vulnerability is ever present, and that love for our neighbor is a sine qua non.
Drawing then upon the philosophy and fiction of these two writers, we consider first how the imaginations of Weil and O'Connor were prophetic in their own time, and second, how their insights may assist us in this pandemic time or any crisis time. We turn briefly first to their individual contexts out of which their writing emerged. In fiction, arising from the red clay soil of Georgia, with reach far beyond the southern United States, Flannery O'Connor illustrates the latent potential for human destructiveness identified by Camus. An Irish Catholic raised in the Protestant South, O'Connor internalized the ambiguities of her own immigrant history, the unsettled legacies of the Civil War, a formation shaped by a Second World War and racial and class divisions, the Civil Rights Movement and Vatican II of the 1960s, the spread of secular materialism and what she regarded as a worldwide drift toward nihilism, and her own suffering from lupus, which claimed her life at 39. With her ironic vision, she sees and depicts with humor the deadly consequences of human follies. O'Connor was devoutly Catholic, with, she said, a modern consciousness. That combination is evident in her wide and diverse reading in history, philosophy, science, and theology. Both her Catholicism and her modern consciousness led her to read with intense interest the first translations into English of Simone Weil's works. The religious and the anti-religious alike applaud O'Connor's works without necessarily delving into the centrality and challenges of her prophetic imagination, both for her as author and readers alike.
Weil, a philosopher and mystic, despite growing up as an agnostic, lived through a pandemic of massive disease, famine, and destruction, brought on by fascism, Stalinist communism, National Socialism, and 2 world wars, the latter of which risked destroying Western civilization. Born in 1909 in Paris, she died in 1943 from tuberculosis at the age of 34 in a sanatorium in Ashford, England. Her philosophical inquiries always had an experiential component. Her life furnished material for her writings on suffering caused by oppressive social conditions, by the industrialization of the workplace, by the disregard of her contemporaries for others' needs, and by her own personal pain from severe sinus headaches. These experiences formed her religious philosophy. Her many essays deal with the human desire to live a meaningful life in the context of love of the world, of others, and of the divine. She wrote of the deposit of pure gold within her and the desperate need to transmit it to others. Although overlapping with Camus' lifespan, Weil, due to chaotic times, never read his works. Weil's insights have a constant prophetic element by foreseeing 2 possible directions at the disposition of humankind. The positive way of justice for all allows individuals to send down nourishing roots in a community whose language and culture preserves its past. The alternative negative way, however, of self-centeredness, indifference to beauty, and the refusal to esteem all others as worthy creatures loved by God, leads to the uprooting of peoples. Uprooting destroys the ability to send down permanent roots of belonging, so necessary to all human beings. Unfortunately, today, far too many people are uprooted. Weil's prediction that the uprooted, in turn, uproot is evident. The substance of her prophetic religious philosophy involves human choices between good and evil, and the motives that encourage more positive choices. To foster communities of rootedness, she insists on valuing truth, beauty, and goodness as indications of God's love for creation.
Can you explain this atmosphere that encourages valuing truth?
Yes, in her need for roots, Weil innovatively lists vital needs of the soul, which must be met solely because of one's humanness. No other qualification is needed. Among these needs of the soul are truth, liberty, freedom of thought, and honor, observed in a social order that cultivates rootedness.
It strikes me, Jane, that whereas Weil presents positive opportunities for society, O'Connor portrays a society that often lacks exactly those traits.
Right. O'Connor's characters illustrate the major obstacle to achieving a loving community: egotism. Weil calls egotism moral gravity, inherent and powerful. To overcome this all-encompassing drive of me first, she proposes an apprenticeship in attentive behavior, for which she repurposes two words. The first, decreation, the converse of creation. The second, reading, an ordinary word extended to reading other people and their inner image of themselves. Her innovative notion of reading the other means putting aside egoistic preoccupations, an effort she calls decreating the ego, and seeing beyond external appearances to arrive at a true reading, which is what God's love would imagine for each of us.
This idea of decreating seems virtually impossible. What does it require?
Ray concedes that decreating our invasive, all-encompassing ego is difficult without God's grace. To love the other who might be dirty, offensive, or even an execrable criminal, we have to remember or be reminded that our own viability is fragile, that we too are vulnerable and could fall victim, through no fault of our own, to affliction, that is, suffering in the extreme, mentally, physically, and spiritually. Yet, she reassures us that the ever-present mystery of God's nearness, even in affliction, means we have access to God's grace by maintaining our love for God, as did Job. The positive force of grace will descend into the material world at our request to help us consent to God's love despite our suffering. And we too, as with Job, will be granted the vision of God's pure goodness. She used her finely honed skills as a writer to persuade her fellow Frenchmen, caught in the throes of secular humanism and under the Nazi occupying booth, to be mindful of every human being's divine teleological goal. The well-being of the soul is fragile. She warned compatriots against unwarranted force used against the other, for it reverberates back to the perpetrator. Quote, contact with the sword causes the same defilement, whether it be through the hilt or the point.
Flannery O'Connor absorbed the ambiguities and contradictions apparent in her region and U.S. society at mid-century. Those, along with her ambivalences about them, shaped her imagination in a world divinely created but degraded by sin and evil. Several of her notable character traits, combined with her aesthetic convictions and unwavering commitment to her art, contribute to the prophetic operations in her stories. Although she was deferential to the Southern culture on which she depended, she thought independently and was alienated from prevailing U.S. cultural values. She lived both the overt and the undercurrent evidences of racism, poverty, and oppression. She refused to adopt social determinism or to align with preordained political or literary categories. Although reverent toward the mystery of the universe, O'Connor exhibited an irreverence toward those who sought to dominate nature and manipulate other human beings. Her appreciation for irony, her sardonic wit, became effective literary means for exposing human absurdities and pointing toward mystery that evokes deeper reverence, if also provoking lingering questions.
Now, on that note, they thought that worthy literature is a source of truth because it deals honestly with eternal questions of good and evil. Quality fiction offers dilemmas that have serious consequences for all involved, and thus allows the reader to participate vicariously in the decisions, but also in the after effects, good or bad. Consequently, the reader can understand the dangers involved without enduring all the evil effects. Such literature has its source in truth, rather than in the character of the artist. For example, Flannery O'Connor knew herself to be a gifted artist, but also an imperfect vessel, subject to influences of the community around her. Now, Ruthann, what in O'Connor's stories alerts us to her prophetic inclinations?
O'Connor signals her prophetic inclinations, I think, in several ways. First, her fiction is notably filled with prophets or those inclined by temperament to the prophetic. The protagonists of her two novels are prophets. In Wise Blood, Hazel Motes, who believes in nothing, professes that he is announcing a new church, the Church of Truth, without Jesus crucified. Francis Tarwater, in The Violet Bear It Away, spends most of the novel resisting the prophetic vocation assigned to him by his self-anointed prophet Uncle Mason. Second, O'Connor intimates connections between her 20th century plots with the ages-old human story chronicled in Hebrew and Christian scripture by giving characters biblical names or alluding to biblical prophets. For example, again, in Wise Blood, Enoch provides Hazel with a new Jesus, a mummy stolen from the Natural History Museum. Obadiah Elihu in Parker's Back has the image of the Byzantine Christ tattooed on his back to win the admiration of his wife, named Sarah Ruth. O'Connor associates the three teenage interlopers in a circle in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel. In A View of the Woods, she hints at the prophet Malachi's instruction to families as grandfather and granddaughter compare one another to Jezebel, described in the book of Kings, and the whore of Babylon in Revelation. Third, O'Connor depicts the enduring devastations of war by presciently overlapping two frames of reference in his story, the eschatological or teleological perspectives with socio-historical realities, or by insinuating theological or psychological reflection into banal conversation.
Well, now, can you illustrate this overlapping of frames of reference in a work of O'Connor's?
Yes. In her story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, O'Connor evokes lingering historic associations of the Civil War that confound the consciences of her characters and readers. Onto A Contested Family Vacation, O'Connor lays references to Civil War era places, personnel, and interpretations. One of the first such references in the story appears when the grandmother points out Stone Mountain, which is not actually visible on the geographic route the family is following. Stone Mountain was the place designated for a statue of Robert E. Lee, encouraged by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which was committed to a romanticized picture of the Civil War. While on the road, the grandmother also regales the children with a memory story about a plantation with a secret panel in the house where the family hid its silver from the advancing General Sherman. After the family has its automobile accident, they meet the misfit, an escaped convict and his helpers named Bobby Lee, recalling the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, and Hiram, the Union General Ulysses S. Grant, whose real name was Hiram. After all others in the family have been shot, under a sky without cloud or sun, the grandmother and the misfit haggle about What is just punishment for evil, and especially for one who's not aware of having committed any crime? The misfit's statement that Jesus thrown everything off balance suggests not merely that judgment should be left to God, but also that retributive justice, an eye for an eye, has been challenged by Christ's inexplicable love mystery offered to all. That truth is echoed in the grandmother's momentary identification at the point of her own death with the misfit's evil and suffering when she says, "Well, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children."
So Ruthann, what about O'Connor's treatment of race and gender in her stories?
Yes, this is, I would say, a fourth way O'Connor discloses her prophetic inclination. In a country and period sharply divided by race and along gender lines, O'Connor complicates prevailing prejudices with a strategy of blurring race and gender divisions. She also mirrors or doubles characters, sometimes grandparents and grandchildren, Black women and white women, even prideful Mrs. Turpin with her hogs. She reflects the fluidity of women's roles spawned by the Second World War economy. In Wise Blood, for example, she portrays women of questionable repute in seemingly unusual and pivotal roles. The prostitute, Leora Watts, who calls herself Mama and calls her residence a hospitality house, suggesting the commodification of family, or Sabbath Lily, who mothers the stolen mummy Jesus. Female farm owners frequently dominate her fiction. Reversals of expectations in O'Connor's stories are common, as Blacks or tenant farmhands who have little agency otherwise in their society may demonstrate brief but uncanny awareness or understanding.
Well, now, do her frequent references to nature contribute to her prophetic strategies?
All the strategies I've mentioned are mirrored in O'Connor's landscapes, where cosmic light and shadow intermingle, where the sun changes color from blood red to white, or maybe absent, or where moonlight dominates preparations for a Dante-esque trip to the city, where colors blend from white and black to brown and yellow, from red clay to clay pink, where dark woods hover and unexpected lusts surge and fantasies impinge on reality. These strategies serve O'Connor's ironic inclinations by dramatizing the ambiguities. While they make visible innumerable varieties of hypocrisy, apostasy, and egoism, they may also prefigure ideal glimpses of integrated and egalitarian community which are latent even in degraded forms. O'Connor's melding of the ironic and the prophetic reveal the artist's consciousness itself wrestling with psychological, social, and cultural inheritances. These inheritances haunt not merely O'Connor, her characters, or the South, but the country and the world. Through her fiction, she contributes, I think, to decolonizing minds, her own included, afflicted by racism and nihilism. The mystery that O'Connor points toward through the concrete, often grotesque details of her region and time is the enduring invitation to receive the true freedom offered by God that requires daily deaths to false selves, fears, narrow ideologies, and illusions.
So let's consider then the wisdom to apply from historic pandemics to the present. Thucydides' description of the 5th century BCE pandemic in Athens reminds us that it undermined the world's first democracy. Boccaccio's Decameron on the Black Plague in 14th century Europe wiped out long-standing, stabilizing social mores. And Albert Camus' imagined plague in 20th century Iran, Algeria, reveals a connection between physical and psychological infection. Today, we see the destabilization of our democracy and the uncurbed hostile conflicts that are being let loose. The psychological trauma from the closing of schools and businesses will be long-lasting. Consequently, Simone Weil's view of the cosmos, as created by God from pure love, can give us a framework for a better society after this period of intense crisis. God's pure love only created that which is good. In order for God to create, God had to withdraw so that creation, the world and its creatures, all that was less than God, could exist outside of God. She writes, quote, God causes this universe to exist, but he consents not to command it, although he has the power to do so. Instead, he leaves two other forces to rule in his place. On the one hand, there is the blind necessity attaching to matter, including the psychic matter of the soul, and on the other, the autonomy essential to thinking persons, end quote. Viruses are a part of the structure of the universe, just as unkindness, mean-spiritedness, selfishness, and greed exist latently within the heart of every human being. But the autonomy essential to thinking persons, which God grants us, refers to our mutual obligations, which, when honored, could mitigate the harm done to ourselves and help us build stronger and better relationships. Fulfilling obligations means giving unself-centered attention to others' needs, the epitome of true love of neighbor.
Jane, where did they suggest specific conditions necessary for building this kind of community?
In the final section of her 1943 Need for Roots, Simone Weil describes the inspiration needed to create community well-being. Of course, she was speaking of France, split into fractious divisions by a brutal enemy occupation. But her advice has relevance for today in the attempt to survive the coronavirus. Above all, there must be an earnest effort to find out what responds to people's deep, heartfelt needs, all the while remaining wary of four enduring obstacles that hinder the formation of a civilization worthy of humankind's highest hopes. The four are, first, quote, a false conception of greatness. Second, a degradation of the sentiment of justice. Third, an idealization of money. And fourth, a lack of religious inspiration. Unquote. Since she believed that what is spiritually good is good in every respect, we must seek what is pure and genuinely good for every member of our community. The task is not easy, but she reminds her readers that if they keep the goal of a more inclusive and just community firmly in mind, they will not lose their way. And what, Ruthann, from O'Connor might apply to this time today?
I think there are at least three things Flannery O'Connor's fiction offers us for this pandemic time. First, with the taproots of her stories in manners, social idioms, grotesqueries that carry an invisible burden, the author's devout Christian faith, and her skill in satire and irony, O'Connor generates a dialogue of sorts among divergent perspectives from which we can learn to read more fully Today, we confront differing interpretations of the virus threat and the outcries against social injustice. We are pressed toward confusion or mystery, which, as Jacques Maritain asserts, exists where there is more to be known than is given to our comprehension. Through fiction, we can consider our own distorted perceptions and read through our illusions, through our perversions and deceptions, toward an ineffable mystery. Right now, I think learning to read the truth of others from a third or God's perspective means confronting our notions of greatness and entitlement. It means examining the perennial miscarriage of justice. It means to question the privileging of economic interests over human lives. And it means acknowledging, with Weil and O'Connor, the pervasive absence of a sense of the sacred. Second, the work of the prophet is always to bring the material and the supernatural to bear on each other, even, O'Connor thought, when mystery is an embarrassment. Embracing her prophetic role as artist, Flannery O'Connor called herself a realist of distances, which means that she was able to see near things rooted in material reality with their extensions of meaning in the invisible, the remote, or seemingly impossible. In pandemic time or ordinary time, becoming ourselves realists of distances is a useful capacity. To perceive the distant in the near, the present shaping the future, to detect mystery, even redemption, in malignities, enlarges our relationship with the cosmos and others. We become realists of distances, I think, by looking backward to acknowledge and redress the racist history of our national past. We can also be realists of distances by envisioning forward the shape of a just social order. Third, O'Connor advised that to understand the prophetic within her stories, one needs to have anagogical vision, which allows one to perceive the presence of mystery in the commonplace, even deeply distressing realities. Anagogical vision, I think, is necessary not merely for reading O'Connor's fiction. It is especially required in pandemic times of unrest, when constrictions, ages-old brutalities still parade, and the closures of death seem to have the final word. To ask and look for what is being disclosed within, underneath, or beyond apparent despair is our common human task.
In conclusion, Weil and O'Connor, the philosopher describing the ideal conditions for human relationships, and the storyteller disclosing human attraction to moral gravity, encourage us to honor the order of the world and contemplate the unity of truth, beauty, and goodness, experienced and expressed best through love of neighbor, and to consent to the transformative power of supernatural love.
Jane, thanks for this conversation, and thanks to those who have joined us.